Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started here in just about 2 minutes. We'll just see if other people join the meeting, but give us about 2 minutes and then we'll get started. All right, good afternoon and welcome to the second of our 4 public comment sessions on the draft rules for event wagering and fantasy sports. And this is the first session on fantasy sports. As you're aware, House Bill 2772 directs the Arizona Department of Gaming to adopt rules and regulations of fantasy sports and event wagering contests. Further, Section 7 of the legislation requires the Arizona Department of Gaming to fulfill the requirements of accelerated rulemaking timeline and exempts the department from the normal rulemaking process. We certainly understand that Arizonans are rightly excited about the advent of event wagering and fantasy sports here in the state. We know they've waited a long time. That's why the department has set an aggressive timetable to go live. And currently, our go live date is by September 9th of 2021. In order to kind of put us in the best position possible to meet this aggressive timeline and to receive feedback in an effective and efficient manner, it made the most sense to us to come up with what we think is a sound and solid draft of rules and make them available for inspection and feedback. The department also decided that it was not going to create the rules behind closed doors, but with as much input as possible from the public, stakeholders, as well as counterparts in other jurisdictions. So our rule writing team has been hard at work to deliver the draft for discussion today. And I understand that normally during the rulemaking process, rules are put out there and they're in their most final form possible. But since we're exempted from the rulemaking process, the stakeholders as well as the public can expect significant changes to the draft rules than how they appear today, based off of both the comments we receive in writing, that you can do so until 11:59 p.m. on Monday, June 21st, or from this session or the ones on Monday. So there will be changes to the rules from what they currently appear as. And while the department has definitely been staying on top of what other jurisdictions that have already gone live with their rules and regulations, there are some unique aspects of the statute that we had to take into consideration. So we can't just adopt another state's rules outright. We did have to craft rules that are applicable here in Arizona and to the statutory regime that's set up. So at this time, I think I'll ask IT if they can go ahead and put up sort of the agenda slide. And while they're getting that slide up, I'll just kind of talk about the ground rules for today's meeting. Again, we're here to receive input on the draft rules. This isn't the proper venue to comment on the merits of either the statute or the recently amended compact or the scope of gaming in the state of Arizona. We're really just focused on the draft rules in front of you today. So therefore, if you're called upon, please limit your comments to the rules. If you're not recognized to speak, please keep your mic muted. You should have seen the instructions of how to do that. And if we get to a situation where there's a lot of disruption or someone's disruptive, we will remove those people from the virtual meeting. So the format for today's session, and then again, is this, just trying to see if the agenda slide is up yet.
One moment, sir.
Okay, great. While he's getting that, I'll kind of lay out generally. We've allotted 3 hours for this meeting. We might not need the whole meeting, but for planning purposes, if we are going long, we'll plan to take a break at 2:30 p.m. We've kind of broken out the subjects into 4 general areas. The first one is kind of the public policy issues. We'd be happy to get input on any sort of input you have on what the licensing fees and the privilege fees should be. I know that there are some stakeholders out there that probably have operations in other states. If you've got input on what other states doing, we're happy to have it. Each speaker, again, to try to afford the most opportunity for people to speak, we're going to limit comments to about 2 minutes per speaker. A staff member will alert you when your time's up. If you wish to speak, please use the raised hand function that's at the bottom of your screen. You should have seen the instruction slides earlier. Or if you're joining by phone, please send an email to public affairs, that's all one word, at azgaming.gov. When it's your time to speak, the staff will call upon you. And if you're sending that email, please make sure you include your first name, your last name, and who you represent. For the rest of you who are joining by Google Meets, when you're called upon, please, for the record, identify your first name, last name, and who you represent. Again, we're going to try to give as much opportunity to the most people to speak. So if somebody's already kind of said your point, don't feel the need to repeat it. Again, you can make more thorough comments in writing and submit them to the department. And just a reminder, we're taking comments on the rules only. So you can see the agenda. The public policy discussion is first. We'll budget right now about 1 hour and 20 minutes. Again, we might not need that whole time. And then 30 minutes for the other 3 issue sets that you see there. And again, we'll just go through this. We'll call on folks until we either hit that time limit or there are no more questions or inputs on the major areas. And again, we want to give people a lot of time to talk, or as many people time to talk. So we're going to kind of keep our comments to a minimum here, and we don't necessarily want to get into question and answering period to take up a lot of that time. But if there are brief clarifications that we can provide, we will do so. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. And again, we're starting the discussion on the public policy issues. And Jason, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and leave the agenda slide up so people can reference it.
Okay.
But we're looking for input on licensing fees or privilege fees.
First up, I see Peter S. has his raised hand.
All right, Peter, if you wouldn't mind saying your first name, your last name, and then who you represent.
Yes, thank you very much. Hopefully you can hear me here. Peter Shanky. I'm with the Fantasy Sports and Gaming Association, where I head up government affairs. And, we represent virtually every fantasy sports company that would apply for a license in the state. So I've been working with our member companies to submit feedback. And if you don't mind, I just would have a little bit of just a kind of a general overview for you. I mean, first of all, I just would like to thank the Arizona Department of Gaming for the outreach and the way they've approached this. This is the second call we've had with you guys. You've been very accommodating. You've listened to our members. You've taken comments. It's an approach that's been very more proactive and welcoming than just about any other state that we work with. But that's why there's a real disconnect with the draft rules that we have seen, which are pretty much the polar opposite of the approach we've seen so far. Rather than use our feedback to follow states like Ohio or Colorado, where we think there's a very industry-friendly regulations with robust consumer protection measures that allow for multiple operators in the state. Instead, this has been a heavy-handed sort of sports gaming and gaming approach to regulation, which doesn't really work with fantasy sports. And so that's a little bit, like I said, just confusing and perplexing, I think, to our industry. More specifically, we've been talking to you for a while, and you've been very receptive. But from our look at the draft regulations, I don't think there's been a single point or bit of feedback from the industry that was taken into accommodation, which again is very confusing given how receptive you guys have been. More specifically, you've also gone beyond sort of the law, what the law mandates in many areas, and made the regulations a lot more cumbersome than they should be. Specifically, the internal control requirements. The Act lays out 9 requirements for internal controls, but the draft regulations have 26 requirements. Similarly, supplier licensing. The Act doesn't require supplier licensing, nor do.
Peter, pardon to interrupt. Your 2 minutes are up, so please wrap up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry very much.
Yeah.
And then lastly, I just think that you haven't really recognized it as a different industry. You require, for example, the American Gaming Association Responsible Marketing Code for sports wagering, but the Act specifically says we're not sports wagering, right? It's a different animal, and I don't think these draft regulations regard that. So that's just kind of a general overview. Sorry, I went a little bit long. Thanks again for the time.
That's all right, Peter. Thank you for that input. And again, as we kind of get into the other things such as their internal controls, et cetera, we certainly welcome you to make further comments or more detailed comments as we kind of move through the agenda. All right. Any other input that folks would like to give on either licensing fees or privilege fees?
Next up, Tim Jensen.
All right.
Tim Jensen, Real Time Fantasy Sports. Yes, I'd just like to talk on Rule 19.4.205, Section H. When you determine the licensing fees for fantasy sports companies, specifically smaller and medium-sized fantasy sports companies that are in the season-long business, maybe not the DFS business, but season-long fantasy games, please take into consideration that many of those companies are small, less than 10 employees, less than $10 million total revenue nationwide, let alone in just Arizona. So I would ask that you consider a structured fee, a tiered fee structure like many other jurisdictions have adopted, where you base the fees paid on either the number of entrants or the licensing fees based on the number of participants they have in the state of Arizona. And I'll second Peter on the supplier licenses. Being nationwide, having supplier license in one of 49 jurisdictions does make it difficult to operate a nationwide contest. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it. And then if you wouldn't mind, if you're done speaking, hit your raise hand function again to take your hand down. That way we know whether or not you still have more to say or you're done speaking.
I do not see anybody else with their hands raised over the policy rules discussion. Oh, we have a Michael Petropoulos.
Hi, Michael Petropoulos, FFPC. I just wanted to piggyback off what Tim was saying a little bit regarding Section H, the fees, and the tiered system. I just wanted to highlight Tennessee as a very a very solid tier system that you could possibly garner some just when you're looking at creating a schedule, a fee schedule, something like Tennessee, because they also have a very similar overall population to Arizona, so it does make a lot of sense to follow a tier system similar to what they are offering, and it is very, very very small business friendly as well as friendly to the larger companies as well, where basically every single operator doesn't have to worry about paying too large of a fee to not be able to operate in the state any longer.
Okay, great, Michael. Thank you for that input. Tim, did you raise your hand again?
Affirmative.
All right, go for it.
Rule 4209 with the establishment of privilege fee, same sort of thing. We've seen some jurisdictions, Indiana, Delaware, etc., Virginia, that have put forth a very large initial fee for allowing fantasy sports companies in, and not understanding that most of the companies that provide season-long fantasy sports are smaller, and have seen that those companies have abandoned the state and have not made any attempt to be licensed or have participants from those states because the fee is more than they would ever make back profit-wise in that state. Virginia has recently come around to revise their rules to make it more affordable so that the smaller businesses and the season-long providers, not just the two largest DFS providers, are able to offer services in the state. And I would just ask that you guys would consider the same.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tim. Peter, do you have your hand raised, or is that from the first time? Oh.
That's just from the first time. So.
Okay. All right. Any other people wishing to comment on licensing fees or privilege fees? All right. Seeing none, we're going to move on to issue set number 1, which contains the internal controls, server and storage, and geofencing. Go ahead and we'll open up the floor. Anyone have comments on those 3 items?
We have an Andrew Wichell.
All right, Andrew, coming back for a second session.
Yes, glad to be back. Thank you. Andrew Winchell from FanDuel. The first one that I'd like to comment on in this section kind of gets into the server. Actually, probably the best one to start with probably is the geofencing requirement. We want to make sure that as fantasy contests are conducted nationwide, and as opposed to sports wagering where you have to geofence to ensure that the customer is within the state in order to be in compliance with the Wire Act, for fantasy sports, the customer can be anywhere in the United States, and you just need to utilize geofence or geolocation solutions in order to derive your tax revenue calculations. So we would suggest actually removing the geofencing requirements entirely because they're not needed as directly to be integrated into the system. So we would have to have, we expect it to have a geofence, a geolocation solution in order to determine the tax percentages, but we wouldn't expect it to maybe be this onerous as laid out in R19-4208.
Andrew, one point I'll just make on that is in the rules, the state of Arizona is defined, as the state borders, but not the Indian reservation. So that's one of the things that we're, looking at. So the Indian reservations are accepted.
I guess that would, my apologies for jumping in without being recognized. I wasn't sure if I was here for the second time. Is that for fantasy contests as well? I'm not of the belief that was, I understand for sports wagering that is, but I was not of the belief that there was a geofencing requirement in relation to fantasy contests in the statute.
We'll take a further look at it.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Any other? All right. Tim Jensen.
In reference to 208, I would concur with Andrew. The geofencing really, we need to have geolocation, obviously, so you can collect your taxes. But the geofencing, I believe it's D, says if the player is not located in the state, they're not allowed to play. Games are offered nationwide. You may have participants from multiple states in a single fantasy league. So when you're recrafting these, please consider that as something we need to take into account.
Okay, great. Thank you. We'll take a look at that. Any further comments from anyone on issue set number 1?
Kevin, you're up.
Great, thank you. Just to quickly touch on the internal controls, to echo what Peter said, the statute does lay out 9 areas of focus for the internal controls. And we would also just like to reiterate that fantasy sports contests or fantasy sports operators don't have to submit internal controls in every state for which they operate. So making them extremely burdensome could be a difficult task. And like we said, because it is an interstate product, the goal is to have them run pretty much the way they do across the country. And that also means that there are terms and conditions, there are other things that we have for players, terms of use, where a lot of this information is found, not necessarily in the internal controls. So we would request that the department, when they're making their next set of draft rules, please incorporate the internal controls to mimic what they are in the statute.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kevin. I believe, Tim, you have another comment?
Sure. 4.213, number 4, it says geofencing testing of all available devices and connection types. With the myriad of different cell phones, tablets, laptops, desktops, and other internet connected devices, and you've got 4G, 5G, cable, wireless, etc. Could that maybe be commercial best practices for geofencing or geolocation rather than specifically saying all available device types and connections?
Okay, great. We'll take that under advisement and take a look at it. All right. Any other comments on issue set? All right, Kevin.
Just quickly, Andrew touched on it, but because fantasy sports is not subject to the Wire Act, we would request that any sort of server requirements that you have to try to limit or place things in state, I know they don't specifically say it, but it doesn't have the same concerns that sports wagering has. So that could also be around the use of cloud storage or anything like that. We would kind of request a more flexible way that we can use servers and use data, and including cloud data.
Great. Thank you, Kevin.
We're going to go with Michael, and then Tim will hop back to you.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. I want to discuss rule reference R194206, the internal control systems, letter G, regarding the independent auditor needing to be licensed in Arizona by the Arizona State Board of Accountancy. Financial audits typically have reciprocity among all states and is not something that requires a license for the auditor within the state. So that's not typically what we see with financial auditors.
Okay, great. Thank you, Michael, for that input. All right, Tim.
Yes, as you perhaps update Rule 4-222, 223, and 224, please keep in mind that many of the companies that offer season-long fantasy, traditional fantasy contests nationwide are smaller to medium-sized companies and have a total headcount of maybe 12 people, maybe 15 people, some less than 10. So with the requirement to have independent departments for IT, accounting, and operations, or whatever the other one was, it can be difficult for smaller firms where everyone is required to wear multiple hats. And in the case of vacation or family emergency or some other event, required to cover the positions of other persons in the company. So for smaller companies such as ours, under 10 employees, it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for us to put up those internal firewalls. I understand the purpose of the requirement, but is there a way we can make that work for smaller companies where people have to wear multiple hats?
Okay, great. Tim, and just you kind of cut out at the beginning. Would you cite the reference again that you're referring to?
Oh, sure. Yeah, rules 222, 223, and 224.
Great, thank you.
Michael, do you have further comment on this issue set?
Oh no, sorry about that. I'll lower my hand.
No problem. We'll go to Andrew then.
Just following on, I guess this is a tag-along issue on geofencing or related to it. Rule 19.4.202. I think this was started to be touched on in another commenter's comment, but at the end of that rule, there's a requirement that participation in fantasy contests shall only be accepted from persons within the state. Pursuant to the act in this article, fantasy contests are inherently multi-jurisdictional events, and thus that line at the end of that rule should be struck.
Okay, great. Thank you, Andrew. Any further comments on that? All right, last call on issue set 1. Peter?
Yeah, I don't know where this fits into the overall structure here, so excuse me if I'm out of turn. But in your opening remarks, you said that there was a date change for the launch of fantasy sports to September 9th. Is that correct? Or was that just referring to sports betting?
We're expecting for everything to go live by September 9th. Right now, we expect fantasy sports to go live before that date.
Yeah, I would just like to reiterate that the timing for fantasy sports is that, especially for fantasy football, which is obviously the biggest product our industry has, that most of those signups happen in August before the season happens. So if there was a way that that date could be pushed back at least a month, that would be something that would be I think very productive for the state. And also, we did make overtures before to you guys and had the idea of temporary licensing based on companies that are licensed in other states. And I would again throw out that idea as a way to at least get the fantasy sports operators up and running very quickly in the state.
All right, thank you, Peter. I appreciate that input. And yeah, we're certainly aware of the timetable, and our plan is to accomplish everything and have fantasy sports go live before that September date. All right, any other questions on issue set 1? All right, moving on to issue set 2. And since we're kind of making good time on this, I'm going to lift the 2-minute limit on people's ability to comment or to make statements. So we'll move on to platforms, integrity and security assessment, events and contests, and player accounts. The floor is open.
Would you like to speak on this issue set, Peter? Your hand is raised.
Sorry, no, that's okay.
All right.
We'll go to Tim then.
My first one would be 4217A. Can we include credit card as a form of payment there? I realize when you walk up to the window and you're placing a bet in a book, usually it's cash, but since all of our clientele is online, credit card is usually the way that 99% of our clientele pays their entry fee.
Okay, Tim, we'll take a look at that again. We had other we had in there other, what's
Okay.
but
As long as
we'll,
it's all right.
we'll take a look at it and see if we can
Thank you.
get clarification.
Great, thank you.
Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you. In relation to the same rule, we would suggest an edit for clarification. Some fantasy operators may operate where they directly take entries via a credit card direct payment, but most, or at least a little sizable number, have an account-based system where players actually use the credit card to deposit funds to their player account, and then that player account is debited in order to pay for the entry. So we would suggest a clarification that the fees for fantasy sports contests are paid, may be made by those forms of payment or from customer accounts which are deposited using those forms of payment in Rule 217.
Okay.
And later in 217H, just to tag on because it's all in the same rule here, there's a requirement that says that fantasy contest entries shall be considered final at the start of the fantasy sports contest. In daily fantasy sports contests, and especially obviously in season-long fantasy events, when you place your entry before either the season starts or before the daily slate of contests start, you set your lineup, but then you will inevitably in season long be adjusting it throughout the season. And even in daily slates, especially like on an NFL Sunday where you have the early games at 1 o'clock, you'll place your entry before 1 o'clock. The players that are in your lineup in the 1 o'clock games will be locked, but the players that are in the 4 o'clock game or later, you would be able to make adjustments because the lineups of those teams are not set until the game is about to be set. So your player that you might have selected might not be starting, so you might want to do a change out. So the standard industry practice is that you're able to do what we call late swaps for events later in the slate of contests that are included for the contest.
Okay, great. All right. Any other comments on issue set 2?
Tim, you're up.
Great, thank you. So mine would be 220. Just want to be clear on 220B1. Responsible parties shall honor player requests for withdrawal funds within 5 days. Can we just clarify that to say initiate request? Because if they request a paper check, we cannot guarantee the post office will deliver it within 5 days, business days. So if we could just initiate in 5 days, that'd be fine. And then in 220B, 2, A, B, C, and D, we have been asked on occasion to suspend payment or make payment based on an investigation by a jurisdiction. They're unable to share with us what the investigation's about, and we only get to take orders. So if we could put some language in there that lets us, if your AG says, hey, hold this guy's funds because we're doing an investigation, we may not be allowed or know what the investigation is about. Just some language in there to cover us so that we can take direction from a jurisdiction on paying out in the event of an investigation.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Michael, you're
And
up.
then well, I had one more on 220C, if you wouldn't mind. Could we make the dormant account be 3 years, which is what a lot of other jurisdictions do? That way, if someone comes to a Cactus League game, they don't inadvertently trigger a 2-year timeout on their account or something like that, and they get the full 3 years they may have had when they were in Illinois, and that's what they were expecting.
All right. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Michael, now you're up.
Yes. In reference to R19-4213, the annual testing, the integrity and security assessment, I understand that the statute requires some sort of auditing, but this seems to be an additional sort of audit that is completely new to any sort of legislation that we've seen or rules that we've seen. And as Tim mentioned, as a small operator, we have less than 10 employees, and it seems like it would be highly burdensome for a company of our size, especially when this doesn't seem to be anything as we've seen in our years of operating.
All right, thank you.
Andrew, you're up.
Yeah, on Rule R19-4218, player account creation, I think we have two concerns that popped up in here. In A, there's a requirement that responsible parties shall verify a fantasy sports contest player's identity before allowing that player to create an account and purchase a fantasy sports contest entry. Generally, the process is to require in other jurisdictions to require the individual be validated prior to placing a contest entry. So we're able to create the account and then be able to use the information from creating the account to validate the player before we let them actually enter a contest. So this is just a suggestion that we remove the prohibition on creating an account until the person has been fully validated, but preventing them from placing a contest entry until they've been fully validated. And then in D sub 9, there's a requirement that responsible parties shall establish a player account file, which has items 1 through 8, and then number 9 is the document or record number of the player's government issued identification. While in certain situations a government ID is utilized when we are having trouble properly validating a customer with the information provided during the regular customer sign-up process, the regular KYC process. It's not always required and needed in order to properly, what we call KYC or know your customer, identify the customer. So in this case, we suggest that it be removed because otherwise we would be required to collect the information on the government issued ID just to put it into the patron file, even if it wasn't needed to properly identify the customer. So
thank you for that input, Andrew. I think the law requires the government ID and social, but I guess I've got another question on the debt set-off requirement. How do we go about fulfilling that and tracking these people and their if they've got a debt set-off here in the state?
Right. The debt set-off piece is, to my understanding, in the statute, is triggered on the issuance of a 1099. So if a customer has earnings which we would report on an annual 1099, at that point, that is when the check would be done to see if the individual had triggered a debt set-off, and then we would go about the withholding process at that time.
Okay, great, thank you.
Tim, you're up.
Great. I'll cover a couple quick ones, but I'll speak on number 9 with the government issued ID. I believe a number of the verification services do not necessarily use government issued ID. They'll match with name, address, and social against the credit bureaus, the 3 big credit bureaus, and verify identity on that. Now you can ask for their internal processes, and most of us subscribe to those verification services. Ask for their internal processes on how they do that. So we don't necessarily get their government issue ID number, even though they may have used it or they have it on record in the verification service. It's not delivered to us as part of the service. They just give us a thumbs up and a thumbs down and the social. So as I believe Michael said, when the 1099 is issued is when the set off is triggered. Okay, so my next one would be Rule 19.4.223. with the accounting and revenue audits item 2 and item 6 ask for a daily reconcile. The nature of season-long fantasy sports is I purchase my team in August and I draft my team sometime before the season kicks off, and then in Christmas, I guess now it's going to be January, the season ends and I find out if I've won and we pay the contest winner. Baseball, they'll start in January and finish in November because that's when the World Series ends. So for us as a season-long operator, a daily reconcile does not make as much sense. And I'm wondering if we could meet somewhere in the middle that makes sense to you guys and makes sense to us, quarterly, annually, whatever it is. But a daily reconcile is going to be day after day of 0-0 because we took no new entries because the season did not start again and it did not conclude. In the DFS world, now you have DFS fantasy operators as well. I do understand the need for daily, but perhaps there can be some middle ground for contests that are operated not as daily, but rather season long.
Okay, great, Tim. We'll take a look at that. Our intent was that you only do the things that are applicable to you. You don't have to do them all. If it's not applicable, you don't have to do it. But we'll take your comments and take a look at it. All right. Any other input on issue set 2? Okay, we'll move along to issue set 3. Promotions and bonuses, minimum internal control standards. What else we got? Player disputes, debt set off, and any sort of miscellaneous topics. And we can, again, go back. If anyone joined late, we can also go back over the agenda.
Andrew, you're first.
Yeah, on this, I'd like to talk about the debt set-off a little bit more. One of the things that we would ask is that the statute provides that the lists be provided to operators in order to check for delinquencies. But we would seek a clarification that the lists are provided in an electronically searchable format. This way, we're able to digest that data and then be able to have it machine read against our customer database to be able to locate the individuals. There are other jurisdictions, unfortunately, that create a way that it has to be done manually, and that's a significant burden on operators.
Great, thanks. I think Warren's got a comment.
So Andrew, the question I might pose here, and maybe to the rest of the group as well, is in considering this, when we looked at it again, does it make more sense if we say that this is just produced to you annually? Since you're really just going to produce your 1099s in probably one big batch that's sent to the IRS, would it make more sense if this is just sent to you annually, one time? And if so, what would be the appropriate time that would need to occur?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I'd have to get back to you on the exact timing because I don't have it off the top of my head. But I see Kevin Cochran just raised his hand. He probably will have more to talk about on that than I do to answer that question. But yeah, I think it potentially would make sense, but it still would be very helpful to be in a machine readable or electronically searchable format for those lists.
Great, thanks. All right, Kevin.
Yeah, thank you. Kevin Cochran with DraftKings again. I think that would make sense to produce it annually. I would just want to caution you guys that depending on when you do it annually and then depending on when we actually perform that check, there could be opportunities where we have missed persons. So the benefit of having a regularly updated list provided to people is that we are not going to have people that have either have a delinquent account to the point that they've made the list, or they would have paid their account and no longer be on that list. So I just want to make sure that we sort of raise that concern. And I think it's something that can be handled between operators and the department to make sure that we're all working in the same direction, but just wanted to raise that concern.
Great, thanks, Kevin. And for the group, we will definitely have our IT folks reaching out to you as we kind of get into the nitty gritty and the mechanics on this issue. I mean, we're doing some meetings internally in the state to coordinate, so we'll be reaching out on that. Okay. Any more comments on any of issue set 3?
We'll go Tim, then Michael.
Sure. My comments apply to 228 and 229, and really all of the rules in general. Please consider that these are nationwide contests, and some of them last the duration of the baseball season from January to November. People move, go on vacation, or change locations. So it might be helpful, specifically on 229 and 228, to clarify whether that means Arizona residents or people physically located in the state of Arizona. And for example, you may have most of the season-long fantasy providers have a kickoff draft party in Las Vegas. So if they are self-excluded or barred in Arizona per Arizona law, but they travel to Las Vegas to compete in one of these draft contests, but they're an Arizona resident, should they be barred or not barred? We could use some clarification, I think, on that. Or I may be barred in the state of Missouri, but I've flown to Arizona to catch some Cactus League games, and I'm going to go ahead and participate in a fantasy baseball draft in the spring because I'm in a different state. How would you like those rules to be enforced in general? Could we be very specific about either residents or physically located in or both, so that we have a knowledge of how we should implement these rules? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tim. All right, Michael.
Yes. For R19 4223 and 4224, similar to 213, the annual testing requirement, these are brand new requirements and seem to just add on to the already existing audit requirements that you have. And these two in particular, for small businesses, just simply would knock us out of the state. It basically requires that we need an accounting department, and that needs to be audited, and we need a separate departments for each audit that you're requiring. And these are just on top of the existing audits that have worked for all other states, like just the regular financial audit, or if you need a compliance audit, then compliance audits from a game testing lab and things of that sort. So these two would more than likely just knock out all small businesses.
Okay, great. Thank you for that input, Michael. All right, any further input on issue set 3, or actually anywhere in the agenda that maybe you didn't feel you got an opportunity to speak, or if anyone joined late to the call? Any comments you'd like to make on this current draft of rules? All right, Peter.
Again, I want to thank you guys for having this forum and the other forums, and I just would like to just kind of make an overarching comment that you guys looked at some other states like Colorado and Ohio, where the fee structures are tiered and are allow smaller operators into the state, and the testing and key employee and investigation costs are lower. And if you look at a state like Iowa, which is very rigid and more regulated along the lines of sports betting, they only have 2 operators. And if you look at the other states that I mentioned, Colorado, Ohio, you have a dozen or more operators. And our industry, our trade association has well over a dozen companies that are interested in getting into the Arizona market right away. And I think if you take the feedback that you've heard from all the members here of our organization into account, as far as the specifics, but and also more broadly, as far as the fees and the testing requirements, I think you'll have a lot of our companies entering Arizona right away.
Great, thank you, Peter. I think it was Tim.
Sure. Just a follow-up question on the whole process. So you'll take under advisement the feedback you've gotten today and written feedback and so forth, and revise some of the rules. At what point will the rules be republished, and will there be a second comment period, or will those be closer to the final and that's the rules we'll plan to launch with? Yeah, I just need to know the schedule, basically.
Okay, that's a good question. So our intent is to take this feedback. We will generate another draft of rules and put them out for a public comment. Likewise, once we've kind of figured out what we need to do, we'll also put out a revised timeline. So we're going to move as quickly as possible, but we will communicate, both on our websites, if we got our email addresses, when we're ready to get that secondary draft out, as well as the revised timeline.
Perfect. We'll go Andrew, then Alex.
Thank you. Just wanted to jump in another one in relation to events that I missed when we were talking about the event section earlier. There's a prohibition against fantasy contests once a sports event has started, and there are fantasy contests that are what are known as partial slate contests. For example, like the second half of an event or a single round of a PGA or event. And so we would suggest removing that requirement in R19 for 217G, which prohibits the events after the start.
Okay, great. Thank you, Andrew.
Alex, you're up.
Yes, hello. My name is Alex Kaganowski. I'm with the FFPC. We're a season-long operator. I just wanted to follow up on what Peter was saying as far as just a broad statement. One thing I would ask and caution against is something that we like to call death by 1,000 cuts. And there's a lot of really small, intricate details that often are required by these regulations that, when you put them together, they just become so overwhelming, so burdensome for a small company like ours. We're also, under 10 employees, and when you consider the size of certain states, with Arizona being one of them, and our total gross revenue, the cost and the fees and the additional hours that we need to spend to comply with all the rules, and then also just some of the tech that we have to build becomes 2 to 3 to 10 times as expensive as what we end up having the profits in the state. So I just again just kind of sometimes it's not just one big fee or one big something, but it's a bunch of little things that really prevent us from operating in some states, which has happened. So I do appreciate it if you would take that in consideration.
Thank you, Alex. Appreciate the input.
Peter, do you have further comment?
No, just an inability to turn off the raise hand button. Sorry.
No problem. All right. I'll do sort of a last call. Any comments that folks want to make on fantasy sports before we conclude this session? And I guess what I'll do is, I know there are some people that have joined by phone. We had asked that if you have comments to make, to send an email to our public affairs email address. Is there anyone on the phone that would like to make a comment on any of the issues that we've discussed today? All right. Well, I just, on behalf of the department, I'd like to thank you all for participating today. And again, I just want to remind everyone that we're going to keep the written public comment section for this draft open until 11:59 p.m. Monday the 21st. So please feel free to submit comments up to them. We are reviewing the comments as they come in, because we understand that folks would like to see a draft turn around as quickly as possible. As soon as we're able to synthesize the information we've got and make our edits, we'll be contacting you either by email or through our social media when we're going to be putting that draft out, as well as a revised timeline based off of the input that we've received. So we will put those drafts out for public comment. Also, just to make you aware, we're recording these sessions. They should be available on our website within 24 hours, about 24 hours after this is done. So if you have colleagues or whatever who couldn't participate, they can check out and see what was said. And then don't forget, you all are welcome to join the sessions on Monday. The fantasy sports session will begin at 9 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time on Monday. And then at 1 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, we'll be doing the session on event wagering. So with that, thank you all for your participation, and we look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.